Hey there everyone, my name is Waffles the Asian Yen Bear and I play One Piece in Japan. Set 4 of the One Piece card game is about to hit the rest of the world, so I'm going to give you the lowdown on what decks perform the best, what new decks to watch out for, and what could be an interesting rogue pick to bring to your local tournament. I've played in a bunch of tournaments over the course of OP-04's meta, as well as taken a look at every single tournament winning deck in the format, and put all the data in a spreadsheet here, which is down in the description. And finally, before we get into this, I gotta give a big thank you to OnePieceTopDecks.com, who made my job a lot easier. They've compiled the database with all this information that I referenced when I was making my spreadsheet. So, with all that being said, let's get into it. When it comes to new decks, green-purple Doflamingo and blue-black Rebecca are the ones to watch out for, but you'd be surprised just how much more often Doflamingo was used. It won 40 tournaments, including 12 flagship tournaments, and here's how it works. You've got your Doflamingo leader that releases in the set, who sets 2 of your Dawn as active at the end of your turn. So you can use all your Dawn during your turn, and defend yourself with some low-cost events and a couple strong blockers. However, Doflamingo doesn't really have much support in his own archetype yet, so this deck utilizes a film character engine with many of the Straw Hats from OP-02 and a lot of cards from the 5th starter deck, so you need both of those, alongside the brand new 10-cost Doflamingo character as a finisher. A large majority of decks run both OP-02 Film Nami and starter deck Buena Fiesta at 4 copies each to act as searchers. Nami tends to be one of the most expensive cards in the deck, mainly due to how popular this deck became, but she is absolutely necessary. On top of that, all decks run starter deck Uda at 4 copies, as her Dawn -1 skill allows you to rest opponents' characters, which makes her a pretty great blocker. The other main blocker you're going to run into is OP-02 Monkey D. Luffy, who has 7,000 power and whose skill allows you to play another film or Straw Hat character, and you're usually going to use that to play Brook, Nami, and or Chopper. There's about an even split between 3 and 4 copies, so it's mostly up to your preference. Many people also tend to run the OP-02 Tony Chopper at 4 copies, but mainly because he's a counter plus 2,000. Another counter plus 2,000 card that you see most of the time is OP-02 Shiki. He's searchable, but again he's mainly just there for the counter. You've got a perfectly even split between 3 and 4 copies on average, but a few decks do run him at 2. Personally, I'm going to recommend 4 copies of him. As far as your more offensive threats go, most people run 3 copies of the starter deck Guild Tesoro, and he helps to give you a little bit more draw power with his Dawn minus skill. However, one of the main benefits of running this deck is that you are almost constantly getting more cards from Nami, so Guild Tesoro is just like icing on the cake. Many people also run the OP-04 10-cost Doflamingo at 3 copies, but I'm going to recommend something a little bit different from the data here. Many people didn't figure it out until the end of the OP-04 meta, but if you run the 8-cost Douglas Bullet from the starter deck here instead, you have the same amount of power and you get double attack. Plus, Douglas Bullet is searchable in this deck, while Doflamingo is not. When it comes to characters that are still good but not seen as often, you've got the OP-02 Brook, which combos excellently with the Monkey D. Luffy. When he's used, people run Brook at 4 copies a bit more than half of the time. A few people also elect to use the brand new 2-cost Sugar at 4 copies. However, a lot of players tend to make a mistake when they use Sugar. You should not default to resting the first character your opponent plays, because then they're just gonna swing at Sugar and she's just gone immediately. Personally, I'd recommend her at 2 or 3 copies, as she tends to be not as useful as some of the other cards in the deck. But the next one here is a card that I am a huge fan of, the brand new Diamante. He is a blocker that has 6,000 power, and as long as he has a Dawn attached, he's going to become active again at the end of the turn. That means you are getting an easy 7k swing on your turn and a 6k blocker on your opponents, all for a 5 Dawn character. He is literally made for this leader, even if he isn't searchable in the film version. The people who do run him tend to run him at 3 copies. Now as far as events go, you want 4 copies of the new Spiderweb card. Spiderweb is a 2-cost 4k counter that sets one of your characters as active again. It's a great card for this deck. A large majority of winning decks also run 2 to 4 copies of Punk Gibson from set 1, which is a little bit of the opposite from Spiderweb. It's also a 4k counter, 2 cost, but it rests an opponent's character instead. Additionally, you're going to want 4 copies of Thunder Bagua from this set. It is such a good purple event and it fits in easily. You might also want to look at adding a couple copies of Paradise Waterfall. It's not used as often, but if you have the room for it, it can act as a mini spider web. When people run it, they tend to use it at 2 copies, but if you do need replacements for Spiderweb, you can use more copies of Paradise Waterfall. You also want to include some copies of Union Armado from the starter deck, since most of your characters are film cards. Now we get into some tech choices, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to highlight a couple. Queen from starter deck 4 is a great blocker, and if you feel like you don't have enough good blockers or enough draw power, pop him in. He can also fit into the Guild Tesoro slot if you don't have access to Guild Tesoro, but if you're playing this deck, you probably have the film starter deck. Captain Kidd from the first set is also a pretty good one to include. Forcing your opponents to attack an 8k character instead of your leader is super nice. Zoro from set 2 is sometimes used, and he basically does what Brook does, but with 1000 more power, but he isn't able to chain into Nami or Bueno Fiesta. If you happen to have the Film Bardo promo, he's a nice one to include as well. Basically, he's just going to make your other characters active again, kind of similar to what Diamante does for himself. Overall, if you already have a lot of the film cards from OP-02 and you've got the film starter deck, I really recommend this one. There aren't that many new cards you need, and most of the ones you do need are pretty cheap. You don't even need the 10 cost Doflamingo to actually make this deck work. It is a strong deck, it's pretty straightforward, but it has a good balance of offense and defense. Now personally, I think the Rebecca deck is a little more interesting, and while both continue to be good in OP-05, almost all of Rebecca's deck comes from this set, since this set introduces the Dressrosa character trait, while Doflamingo gets a lot of new cards in set 5. But the game plan for Rebecca is actually pretty simple. You dump cards into your trash until you have at least 15. You use your cost lowering cards to control your opponent's board and your blockers to stall for time. Then, when you have an opening, you pump up Gear 4 Luffy, swing once, use his ability to refresh him, then swing again, and boom! You have taken 4 life from your opponent. While it's simple, and almost all of your opponents are gonna be aware of it and watching out for it after the first 2 weeks of the set being out, there's only so much people can do to stop a 13k Luffy coming at their face. So, let's look at the deck. So Rebecca can't attack, but she does offer you draw power, and more importantly, trash power. You're going to be using her leader skill often to set up your combo. Every Rebecca deck in OP-04 also runs Orlumbus, Gats, Kiros, Sabo, Bardo, and Luffy, mostly at 4 copies each. Orlumbus gives an opponent's card -4 cost and then lets you trash 4 cards from the top of your deck, but you have to KO one of your characters. Now here's the thing about that. You're either going to be KOing things you no longer need, or you can get around that by using Sabo's ability or KOing Kiros, who just will rest your Rebecca leader or your stage and then he's fine. Once the enemy's card's cost is down, you drop Kiros or Leo and you KO it, essentially just getting rid of any cards that are 5 cost or lower. Kiros is what you're going to be swinging with to poke at your opponents while you wait to set up your combo. Sabo is your main blocker, who also provides draw power, and you've got Bardo for another blocker, but he also has a 2k counter, so it really does depend on the situation, and Gats is mostly just there for the 2k counter. And Luffy, as I said earlier, is your endgame. He's a 7 cost, 7k power that can send 7 cards from your trash back to your deck in order to become active again. But similar to what happened in the Dressrosa arc, he then doesn't become active in your next refresh phase. Something people don't tend to realize immediately is that if you use this skill and not attack the second time, you're able to prevent other decks from attacking into the Luffy. You only need 15 in your trash to do the combo, so if you feel like you need to wait a little while for an opening, you can make the most of this Luffy skill to get some 7k swings in, but still keep him safe. Now some people choose not to run these next 2, but most are running them at 4 each. The character Rebecca provides extra search, and Leo is helpful so you're not just relying on Kiros for KOs. Idio is also a character people tend to run as an extra blocker, but he does tend to be one of the weaker links. For now, you should run him, but then he's going to get replaced in the deck list in set 5. When it comes to events and stages, you want to run Corrida Coliseum. It lets your characters attack active characters, and it helps with your whole controlling the board thing. It's a pretty close split between 3 and 4 copies, so it's up to your preference. Trueno Bastardo is often run at 3 copies as another way to KO opponents' characters in some situations. And you're also going to want somewhere between 2 and 4 copies of 3000 Worlds from set 3. Some people do tend to run Barrier from set 4 as well, but honestly I can't really recommend that unless you have some extra space that you just need to fill. But let's talk about Gum Gum King Kong Gun. This is the second part of your Luffy combo. It's a 3 cost and it gives one of your Dressrosa cards plus 6,000 power. But the best part is if you have 15 or more cards in your trash, it also gives double attack. That means at minimum, your Luffy is a 13k attacker that can attack twice with double attack. And again, that is at minimum. I have had games where people drop 2 King Kong guns and there is no stopping that without a good blocker. Most people tend to run it at 3 copies because you really only need 1 to start the combo and you don't want extra copies to be clogging up your hand. As far as tech cards go, both copies of Kuzan tend to be the better ones, but you've also got some people running Kaya for some more draw power or Gum Gum Red Rock for more control. I'd recommend this deck if you like a more patient playstyle. You need to be able to think long term and keep working towards your endgame. If you drop the King Kong gun too early when your opponent has an answer, it can pretty easily backfire on you. It seems like it continues to be a good deck in set 5 with a few improvements added then, so if you like the deck, it's a good investment. However, this deck can be a little bit expensive since many of the cards are new. Now as far as the other top decks go, you do still see Yellow Katakuri, Red Whitebeard, although I'm gonna just asterisk that one for the English meta, Red Zoro, and Red Green Law all doing really well. So let's take a look at them and see if there's any major changes you need to make if you're running those archetypes. Katakuri gets better with this set with the addition of Capone as a new 2k counter trigger, Sanji as a reliable blocker, Perospero for more offensive pressure, and Amande as an early game attacker. You're going to want to run Capone and Sanji at 4 copies. 6 cost Perospero tends to be mostly run at 4 copies, but you do have a handful of players that run him at 2 or 3, and Amande is also run at 4 copies and tends to be replacing Smoothie in most decks. A few people also run the OP-04 Yamato at 2 copies, but if you have access to the 8 cost Katakuri from OP-03, then the Yamato is kind of unnecessary. You also see a few people running Pound, but again, if you've got the new Sanji, Pound is also unnecessary. When it comes to Whitebeard, it's basically unchanged. The only new card you see in any deck build is Rebellious Kick Course, but it is a tech card at best. If you're already running Whitebeard, you don't need to change anything. It was a very strong deck in OP-04, but Japan doesn't have the limit on Edward Newgate or Radical Beam, so it is a little bit hard to judge how good that's going to be for the English meta. That being said, this is probably the last set you can use Whitebeard Pirates, as it does seem to be dying out in set 5. Zoro doesn't have any major changes this set. You've got Rebellious Kick Course that was literally used in 1 winning deck, and the new 1-cost Sanji that made it into 4 decks, but if you're already comfortable with Zoro, you don't need to change anything here. For Red Green Law, set 4 adds Sugar as a tech card, which actually fits the deck relatively well. She really wasn't used that much, but I do think it's a card to consider. Otherwise, Law is still Law and still good. Starter Deck 10 came out near the end of OP-04 here, and if you like playing a Law deck, I do recommend picking up a couple copies. Red Purple Law is pretty good, especially after set 5 releases. Now of course, there were a few other leaders that came out in this set: Yellow Blue Queen, Green Black Isho, Red Blue Vivi, and Yellow Purple Crocodile. There was a brief period in the meta where Queen was popular, so you see a lot of her wins happening in the same time period. However, ultimately I'd still kind of just consider her a rogue deck. Vivi was probably one of the most hyped going into the set, but the Alabasta archetype is really underwhelming, and I don't recommend investing into it at all. Baroque Works with Crocodile continues to be one with a lot of potential, but it's still really missing the one thing to tie it all together. And Isho is actually pretty decent, but he tends to just play the same as most other Black Navy decks do. You see the deck running the same stuff, but with the added twist of having access to X-Drake and a couple other good cards like Spiderweb. When it comes to rogue decks that are just fun to bring but not major game winners, we've got my personal favorite deck, Blue Nami. She technically gets 1 new card of support in this set with Apis, who searches an East Blue card, but it comes at the cost of trashing 2 cards in hand, which makes her a tech card at best. If you're a Nami player, you don't need to change anything you do with this set. Purple OP-02 Magellan gets better once Starter Deck 10 releases, as they tended to incorporate the purple blocker Law and the 7-cost Captain Kidd. Blue-Purple Starter Deck Kaido gets some new support with this pack. If you like Kaido, you're going to want to add 4 copies of Who's Who for search, and a couple copies of the new 10-cost Blue Kaido. When it comes to which deck did the best in this meta, I've used a weighted ranking system to tally the results with flagship wins and championship placements counting for 2 times as many points as standard battle tournaments. And championship wins, so that's getting first place, that's going to count as 5 times as many points as standard battles. Using that system, we see that Whitebeard Pirates continues to dominate the meta in first place. That's followed by green-purple Doflamingo and yellow Katakuri in close second and third. Zoro comes in fourth with Law close behind, and lastly, Rebecca ends up at the bottom. But keep in mind, that is the bottom of the top decks in the format, and she's the only one with most of her cards coming from this set, so I don't think you need to count her out just yet. But that's going to be it for me today. My name is Waffles the Asian Yanbear, and I make content based on the things I like, so if we share some interests, go ahead and click that subscribe button. And if you like this deep dive into the OP-04 meta, leave a like and let me know what deck you're going to be playing in tournaments this season. I'm still trying to find what kind of deck I want to play in OP-05, but I spent most of OP-04 playing Nami, just because it's the most fun for me. Anyway, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.